Every so often I do one of these retrospective type videos where I take a driver, a team, a period within a team, a period within a form of motorsport or other things along those lines and look at what went right, what went wrong, how it went wrong, why it imploded, how it imploded, and what the result was for everybody involved. And the reason it's nice to do these kinds of videos is because things get distorted over the years, don't they? You might see something on Reddit or on YouTube where it's mostly feelings that are telling the story, and sometimes it could end up being distorted because it's 28th hand news, because it came from a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who is mates with the cousin's dad of the brother of the guy who knows a mate who delivered milk to Martin Brundle's house back in 1981. The list is slowly getting longer. It started last year with videos on Fisichella, Coulthard and Alesi, and since then I've added to it with videos on Brabham after their BMW years, Lotus after Chapman died, the Williams BMW years, Jaguar, Toyota and some others. Like this video, they'll all be on their own playlist where you can watch them all at your leisure, because I've done a few of them now, and the facts, stats and info piles up after a while. They're also fun videos to do, and the whole list is on your screen now, just in case you want a taster. The last of these videos was made back in August when I looked at the career of Mika Häkkinen and how good he actually was, considering he had that brain injury at the 1995 Australian Grand Prix. So today we're going to be looking at Daniel Ricciardo because, well, it's as good a time as any to do this kind of video, because a lot of people at one point were saying that this guy would be a champion, and his career since then seems to have gone arse over head. So what went wrong? Let's have a look, shall we? For this, we start back in 2012 when a young Daniel Ricciardo started out with the HRT team, a team lost to the history books, and a team that was one of those where it's a miracle they lasted as long as they did. Red Bull had paid for Ricciardo to take a seat at the team, and he made his debut at the 2011 British Grand Prix. He was due to hand the seat back to Carther Kane for the Indian Grand Prix, but Liuzzi, another former Red Bull driver, was cast aside for the Indian so he could race at home. Ricciardo got some experience and, well, that's about it. But that's all that mattered. He got some experience. The car was more often than not on the back row of the grid, and it was finishing 2, sometimes 3, maybe even 4 laps behind everybody else. One of the races he did, he was not classified because he was so far behind. So we'll just ignore all of that because there's nothing to pick apart there, and we'll just move straight into 2012 when he was at a real team. With a better car and back within the Red Bull family, Ricciardo made his real debut with Toro Rosso at the 2012 Australian Grand Prix. In front of the home fans who had him and Webber to cheer for that year, he managed to make a late lunge on his teammate Jean-Eric Vergne to finish 9th and score 2 points, his first ever points in Formula 1. Following this, he finished 12th in Malaysia and then stunned most of the paddock by not only making the third qualifying session, but getting his Toro Rosso into 6th, half a second from Vettel's pole time and just a 10th off Rosberg in a superior Mercedes. Vergne, meanwhile, was in 19th and didn't make it out of the first qualifying session. Neither did Schumacher. That's not a dig, by the way, because I know a lot of people are like, oh, he had to make that dig at Schumacher, but that's just an observation. I'm seeing these results for the first time in about 12 years, so there's going to be a lot of stuff that I don't remember seeing at the time. But in the race, Ricciardo just went backwards. Most of the more experienced guys around him overtook him and he was down to 11th by turn 1. Then he got tagged somewhere around turn 10 and damaged his front wing in the melee. So at the end of the race he was down in 15th, 1 lap down and behind Vergne. Despite the points in Melbourne, it was difficult thereafter. Bahrain wasn't his fault and both Toro Rossos were off the pace in China. Vergne scored points in Malaysia, but the run was incredibly barren up to the Belgian Grand Prix where both cars scored again. And following that, Ricciardo was able to make the top 10 on another 4 occasions, and only retired once all season at Monaco. Despite Ricciardo scoring more points finishes, 6 to Vergne's 4, all 4 of Vergne's points finishes were in 8th place, so Vergne finished with 16 points to Ricciardo's 10. 2013 didn't get off to a good start. He retired from both the opening races with exhaust issues, but then finished 7th in China for his best ever finish in Formula 1 up to that point. Despite not finishing ahead of Vergne in the point standings, Ricciardo was utterly demolishing Vergne in the qualifying battle, amassing a record of 30-7 in the Aussies' favour, which is pretty damn impressive. Over the course of the 2013 season though, Ricciardo was able to pick up scraps of points in a few races, as well as getting an impressive 5th position in qualifying for the British Grand Prix that year. Ricciardo ended the season in 13th on 20 points, while Vergne wasn't that far behind on 13. With Webber leaving Formula 1 to join Porsche in the World Endurance Championship, Red Bull needed to promote somebody up from the junior team up to the senior team. So with one Australian going out, another Australian would be coming in, Ricciardo getting the nod in favour of Verne. Considering he had a 4-time world champion as his teammate, Ricciardo didn't seem to think that would be an issue. His first race in the Red Bull senior team, he managed to qualify second, splitting the all-conquering Mercedes cars of Hamilton and Rosberg. Ricciardo was given a free position when Hamilton had engine issues on lap 2, and it was a case of just following Rosberg home, despite having some late pressure put on him by Magnussen, who was making his debut for McLaren. Rosberg crossed the line first to take the first win in the hybrid era, while Ricciardo finished second. Until he didn't, because he was disqualified for not having enough fuel in the car. But the takeaway from that race was this. Ricciardo had qualified in second in between Hamilton and Rosberg. Vettel, the 4-time world champion at this point, was only 13th. Was this going to be a regular occurrence, or was it just a one-off? The next race had people thinking it would be a little more indicative of how performance was going to be for the rest of the season. Hamilton was on pole with one of the Red Bulls splitting him and Rosberg, and this time it was Vettel. Ricciardo would be 5th on the grid behind Alonso, who was driving a shed of a Ferrari, but Ricciardo retired with wing issues late into the race. In the next 3 races, Ricciardo would beat Vettel to the flag and get a podium in Spain and Monaco before taking his first ever win at the Canadian Grand Prix, being in a prime position to take advantage of the 2 Mercedes cars having their brake issues that forced Hamilton out, with Rosberg hanging on for second and Vettel completing the podium in third. Ricciardo finished every race for the rest of the season in the points, his retirement at Brazil excluded, and would also take 2 more wins in Hungary and Belgium, while Vettel could only finish 7th and 5th in the same races. Ricciardo won 3 races over the course of 2014, Vettel won none, and Vettel could only better Ricciardo just 3 times all season in races where they both finished. As it was, Vettel departed Red Bull for Ferrari, and in his place came Danny Ric. The problem with the 2015 car is that it was woefully underpowered versus the offerings from Mercedes and Ferrari. The Red Bull chassis was pretty good. I mean, it's an Adrian Newey car, what do you expect? And it did do well in slow and twisty sections of tracks or on tight tracks like Hungary and Monaco. But it was just outclassed everywhere else. Christian Horner even made threats that Red Bull could quit Formula 1 if the FIA didn't allow some concessions for the Renault teams to catch up in the engine development department. Not only that, the engine was also as reliable as a 1980s Italian sports car, breaking down so often that Ricciardo was on his 4th engine by the time they went to Bahrain. They did score a double podium at Hungary, and Ricciardo got another podium at Singapore, but Kvyat finished ahead in the standings due to outperforming Ricciardo 10-9 in the races, but Ricciardo had consistently outqualified the Russian, beating him 14-5. Now, a couple of these times that Kvyat beat him weren't necessarily on pace alone. One example of this being at Hungary, where Rosberg dive-bombed his way to turn 1 and clattered the Red Bull, damaging both cars and allowing Kvyat to get up into second. Ricciardo was in second when that collision occurred and had been hunting down Vettel at the time. He might have been able to win that race. The car was that bad they actually finished behind Williams that year, and that's something I need to do in the future, is a look at the Williams-Martini era, because low drag car, very powerful engine, why didn't they win at least one Italian Grand Prix? But that's one to look at in the future. But 2016 would be a better year for Red Bull, but there was a new challenge emerging. A run of 4th places in Australia, Bahrain and China opened Ricciardo's 2016 season. He had been leading the Chinese Grand Prix until a blowout meant he dropped back, but in every case he managed to score a decent points finish. For the Spanish Grand Prix, Kvyat was dumped for Verstappen, and when the Mercedes cars took each other out on the first lap, Ricciardo led until Ferrari went with a strategy call that forced Red Bull's hand. Ricciardo was pitted to cover Vettel, and this put Verstappen into the lead ahead of Raikkonen, and Ricciardo was now in 4th with Red Bull's strategy call being what it was. Verstappen went on to win the race, and Ricciardo, once again, finished 4th. Then it was the catastrophe of the Monaco Grand Prix. Ricciardo had been on pole, the first time he'd ever been on pole, and was leading until a bizarre situation happened with his pit stop. He pitted, but there were no tyres. Ricciardo claimed it was the second time in as many races he'd been screwed and was visibly upset, but things didn't get much better since he was then 7th in Canada and Azerbaijan. Results then picked up a bit after that. 4th at Silverstone, 3rd in Hungary, and then 2nd in Germany, where he debuted the Shoei. He's actually not the first driver to do the Shoei, because David Reynolds had done one in V8 Supercars the previous year. He would get second in Belgium and then second again at Singapore, where he almost beat Rosberg. He also picked up the win and led Verstappen home in Malaysia, which was his first win of the season. He was also the only driver other than Perez to finish every lap in 2016, so at the end of the 2016 season, he was third. For 2017, there would be new regulations, new cars, and the rise of Verstappen was well underway. With Ferrari also making a bit of a comeback, things were going to be getting a little bit harder. But he had the talent, so there was that thinking that he'd cope just fine. In modern Formula 1, seeing so many retirements on a stat sheet makes for pretty grim reading. Something seemed to be going wrong on the Red Bulls almost on a race-by-race basis, and there would be 6 retirements for Ricciardo and 7 for Verstappen. Although one of Verstappen's retirements was a collision that wasn't exactly his fault, that one being at Singapore. Verstappen would also win 2 races to Ricciardo's 1, but Ricciardo was consistently able to get podium spots, mostly thirds, while Verstappen was more likely to be 4th or 5th. The car was the 3rd best car on the grid by a long way, with Vettel and Hamilton battling for the championship up until Ferrari's season collapsed around the Singapore Grand Prix. The 2 Red Bull drivers would finish together in the standings, with Ricciardo getting 200 points to Verstappen's 168, but Verstappen was now showing his potential to Red Bull. Verstappen won 13.6 in qualifying and had finished ahead 5.2, this being in races where they both finished. Verstappen had also been ahead of Ricciardo 371 laps to 156, so the only thing that Ricciardo had beaten Max in all year was the overall points. Makes you wonder what it would have looked like if Max's car had been more reliable. Christian Horner even said that the RB13 had been lucky for one driver and unlucky for the other. The momentum developed by Max seemed to go off a tiny bit into the start of the 2018 season. By the mid-season point, Ricciardo was leading 4-1, but by the end, Ricciardo hadn't got Max beaten on any single statistic. Verstappen won qualifying 14.5, finished ahead 8.4, finished ahead in the points 249 to 170, and in the laps ahead statistic 746 to 217. For 11 races in a row, Max outqualified Daniel, and with the reaction from Red Bull management to their collision at Baku, Ricciardo was looking for a way out. Not only was Verstappen now having more influence in the team and becoming the one that management wanted to throw the weight behind, the car was also a dog. A retirement at the Bahrain Grand Prix early in the season meant that it was the 4th time in 5 races that the car had given up on him. There's the already mentioned collision at Baku, and then at Austria, Germany, Spa, Monza, Austin and Mexico there'd be more retirements. It seemed then that the luck in the reliability department had swapped back, and now it was Ricciardo getting the bad luck instead of Max. Daniel did, however, put on some good performances during the 2018 season. At Monaco, he held off Vettel for the win despite having issues with his car, and at China, he and Verstappen had pitted for tyres under a safety car, with Ricciardo overtaking 5 cars in 8 laps to secure a victory. But on the flip side, after his Monaco Grand Prix win, he didn't stand on the podium once afterwards, and slid down to an anonymous 6th in the standings. In the August of 2018, he announced he was leaving Red Bull. So did he kill his career with that one decision to leave Red Bull? Verstappen was clearly their new pet project, and I think Daniel was starting to feel a little bit like how Vettel was in 2014. So there was gamble on going somewhere else and maybe getting lucky with the car or helping to bring that car back up through the field to be in a position where they could win races, or stay at Red Bull. Either way, it's a tricky decision. So his gamble led him to Renault. There was a big pay packet offered which led to the nickname The Money Badger being thrown around online, and it would give Ricciardo the opportunity to work with a new team and be the number 1 driver and offer a new challenge of bringing a team back through the field. Renault had the money, they had the resources, but didn't really have much to show for it on their return to Formula 1 in 2016. But this new chapter in his F1 career wiped off smiles almost instantly. There was front wing damage in Australia. There was a power failure in Bahrain. He did score points in China with a 3rd qualifying session appearance to add to that, but then at Baku, there was a bizarre incident with Kvyat when he reversed into the Toro Rosso when they both went off at the first corner. Points came at Monaco and Canada, but at the French Grand Prix he was given 2 5-second penalties on the final lap that put him out of the points. Silverstone, he scored, but his exhaust went in Hockenheim and was without points in Hungary. Then a collision with Stroll at Spa left him right down the order, but was rewarded with 4th place at Monza. At Singapore, no points. Russia, a retirement. And then he was disqualified from the Japanese Grand Prix after finishing 6th because of the illegal brake balance software. The final part of the season was a little bit better and was giving him hope for 2020. 8th in Mexico, 6th in Austin, 6th in Brazil, and 11th at Abu Dhabi. Even though he'd had his fair share of bad luck with reliability and being involved in other people's lack of spatial awareness, he was still doing well in the midfield. The results from that 2019 season don't paint a full picture as a result of that. Other articles by people who know Formula One's inner workings a lot better than I do have all said the same thing. The 2019 season shouldn't be written off. Going into 2020 though, we started to see more of the Daniel that we'd seen at Red Bull. Was he back? Maybe. Despite the topsy-turvy calendar due to the situation at the time, Ricciardo was in the points at all but 2 races that he finished, including 2 podiums at the Eiffel Grand Prix at the Nürburgring and the race at Imola. On top of this, he took 2 fastest laps at the Belgian and Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Any misgivings about his shock move from Red Bull were starting to go away, and people in the media were starting to entertain the idea again that this guy could be a world champion if he had the right environment in which to thrive. But at the end of that 2020 season, as he and Renault enjoyed a massive return on points where he finished 5th overall, not far behind Perez in the pink Mercedes, he was off to McLaren to replace Carlos Sainz, who would be going to Ferrari. It was a move that made sense. A driver that was well liked and had proved he was quick, going to a team that was on the up and had a young driver who could use a little bit of a pointer in the right direction. 2 charismatic drivers and a team on the up, what could possibly go wrong? It turns out, a lot. All that optimism vanished when it was clear that Ricciardo was struggling to adapt to the car and was being beaten on the regular by Norris. The McLaren was a little tricky, and going into a team that will have already have designed the car around Norris was going to take some adapting to. But for whatever reason, it seemed that he just could not click with this car. But as many of his fans will want to point out, he won at Monza. That's probably the only highlight he had of that season, because Norris was able to find his way onto the podium 4 times in the same car. Ricciardo's win was his only visit onto the podium for McLaren that year, and only one of the 5 times he beat Lando. Okay, 6 if you want to include the Belgian Grand Prix. I mean, I'm a massive George Russell boy, but that podium that Russell got for Williams comes with a hefty side of, yeah, but. It does become 4 if you include the Russian Grand Prix as well, but that's down to Lando not knowing when to change tyres. So the 2021 season started to replace that optimism with doubt. Did this guy peak too soon? Is he a newie merchant? Has he been found out by going to another team? These questions would be asked even more as Formula One entered the ground effect era and the cars changed completely. Before, cars would have the face-down, booty-up, high rake design where the rear end would fall over and generate turning. Now, the cars are running incredibly low to the ground, and as some drivers found, adapting was not going to be easy if they liked a pointy car. Ricciardo was one of those drivers that didn't really adapt. The driving style to drive that 2021 McLaren was completely on the opposite end of how he likes his cars. Lando, Lewis, Fernando, Max, guys like that could lob their car in hard on the brakes. Daniel, meanwhile, as Andrea Stella explained to the race, liked to roll the car in and not be on the brakes as hard, and the 2021 McLaren wasn't allowing him to do that. At Monza, where he won, the problems weren't so evident because of how the layout of the circuit is, but at pretty much everywhere else, he was like a fish out of water. Now with the ground effect cars, which won't turn in as well into slow speed corners, Lando could utilise an unstable rear end to get the car to rotate a little bit more, something that Max and Lewis would be able to do as well. Well, I mean, Lewis might have been able to do it if his car wasn't a 220 mile an hour space hopper, but either way, those guys could get away with it if the car would let them. Ricciardo had to have some safety understeer dialed in, which hampered him in long corners. Long story short, Daniel couldn't get his head around these cars, much like Vettel couldn't after 2013 when all the rear downforce was taken away, which might explain the spinning. But it was clear that Ricciardo had fallen right off a cliff and was in the shark-infested waters below. So as it was, Ricciardo was down in 11th in the standings at the end of 2022, equal on points with Vettel in the Aston Martin and about 90 points behind his teammate Norris, who managed to get a podium at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix at Imola. Following this season, Ricciardo would be cast aside as McLaren played 4D chess to sign Piastri, and Ricciardo went back to Red Bull to be the test and reserve driver. But then midway through the 2023 season, Ricciardo was offered a lifeline. He'd be going back to Toro Rosso, now called AlphaTauri. Replacing Nick de Vries, things didn't go so well, as after just 2 races he broke his hand in a crash and had to sit on the sidelines for about 5 races. When he came back, he scored just 1 points-paying finish at Mexico and would then be back in the car full-time for 2024 alongside Yuki Tsunoda. but things didn't really pick up at all for him after that. He'd scored 12 points before his final appearance at the Singapore Grand Prix, where it'd be announced nearly a week later that he'd be removed to make way for Liam Lawson. And this drummed up some questions from the video I did on Ricciardo last week as a, why are they getting rid of him type of video, whereas this is the full retrospective. Someone mentioned that maybe he'd got a little bit complacent. Maybe he was too caught up in whether or not Perez might get the boot, and then that would allow Daniel to go back up into the senior Red Bull team where he might be able to salvage something. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. But it's clear to see that since his move to McLaren, things haven't been exactly great. Beaten by Norris in 2021, destroyed by Norris in 2022, and now moved aside for a junior driver in Red Bull's cutthroat development system with just 6 races left of the 2024 season. It does seem like a talent that was never fully realised. Sometimes you've got to be in the right place at the right time. Ricciardo was never in that top tier driver slot occupied by the likes of Hamilton, Verstappen, Alonso, Raikkonen and guys like that, but not many drivers make it into that bracket. But had Ricciardo been offered the same opportunities like Button and Rosberg had in their careers, where they fell into the right place at the right time, then there's every possibility he might have been more successful, maybe even a champion. But with all the stats and highlights of various things put into this video, maybe that's something for you all to have a discussion about in the comments. From 2014 up to about 2017, he was one of the better drivers on the grid. It's that his car was either underpowered, unreliable, or both, and that's not going to help anyone, irrespective of how good they are. At his best, he was challenging Hamilton, Rosberg and that overpowered Mercedes, but at his worst, he became a meme. And when you look at that meme versus what he achieved in a car that suited his driving style, then you wouldn't believe that both of these drivers were the same driver. It does seem a pity that he fizzled out after a massive drop-off. Certain F1 podcasts online seem to be going mad that he never got a proper send-off because a lot of people liked him. But that's the thing. Formula 1 and the people in it aren't into that kind of thing. Win a championship or two and you might get one of these proper send-offs. If you don't, well, there's always somebody else. Ricciardo might have been liked by a lot of fans, but after that fall-off in 2021, he was eaten alive by the cutthroat sport that is Formula 1. So then, a look at the career of Daniel Ricciardo, looking at where it completely fell off for him, and whether some of those bad years weren't really as bad as we remember them being, or if, the stats paint a different picture. If this video has given you food for thought, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and also get a discussion going in the comments. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks, as ever, go out to the rad lads over at Patreon on the updated Patreon list for the continued support. And if you want to help out around here, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates, and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks there if you just want to do a one-and-done donation, and memberships if you want to do Patreon without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.